They say war is chaos. But chaos was the one thing I learned to control. The chaos brought by the typhoons, the chaos of a disorganized retreat, even the chaos of panic. These were variables that could be factored into a calculation. The real war, the one that broke me, began when I realized the enemy wasn't seeking victory over our will or our courage. They were simply burying us under such a colossal volume of steel that we became a mathematical error slated for eradication. I am Hauptfeldwebel Karl Hellmann, 32 years old, Chief Signals Officer for the 22nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment. I was the chief technician for the nervous system of this dying organism, and I could hear those nerves fraying. The July dust in Normandy was unlike the dry, chalky powder of Russia. Here, in the bocage, it was heavy, wet, and clung like ash from a chimney. It settled on the antennae, seeped into the casings of the FUG-10 radio sets, and lodged in our lungs. For 5 weeks, we had been entrenched in this labyrinth of narrow lanes and tall hedgerows, French peasant fortresses that were rapidly becoming our tombs. The bocage was excellent for ambushes, but it was absolute hell for logistics. And for us, the signalmen, it was the worst enemy. Those damned earthen banks choked the signal, forcing us to dangerously raise our antennae higher than safety allowed. We were positioned in a barn half a kilometer behind the forward edge, somewhere south of St. Lo. The barn was better camouflaged than any command post. We knew if we were spotted, they wouldn't send infantry. They would send an aircraft that would obliterate our shelter into splinters. Temperature nominal, Carl, muttered Muller, my youngest operator. He was a good man, possessed an absolute ear for sound, but his nerves were like piano wire pulled taut. He constantly wiped his headset, as if scrubbing away the feeling of imminent doom could clear the static. The temperature of the batteries, or yours, Muller? I asked, without lifting my head from the signals log. I was checking the fuel consumption for the generator. Catastrophic. If the diesel didn't arrive by morning, we'd be reduced to yelling commands across the trenches. Beside me, Wagner, a stoic who seemed to have survived the fall of Constantinople and remained utterly unmoved, methodically checked the grounding wires. Wagner didn't talk. He worked. His methodical labor was the only thing keeping me within the bounds of professional sanity. If Wagner was working, the world still had structure. Our regiment had sustained 60% casualties. We were tethered to these blasted hedgerows like prisoners at the stocks. Every time the infantry or grenadiers requested support, I had to relay the staff's canned response. Contact adjacent sector. Our guns are silent until further notice. Conserve ammunition. I heard the commanders cursing into the microphone. I understood their fury. But I knew what they didn't, something my job forced me to grasp. We had no shells. We were out of diesel. And we hadn't had a single friendly aircraft overhead in 4 days that could even drive off those persistent American reconnaissance planes, the L-4 Grasshoppers, which circled above like silent, malign judges. My main job was not to transmit our messages, but to listen to theirs. I knew their procedures, their call signs, their mannerisms, too calm, too certain. They spoke of coordinates, reinforcements, and trucks laden with fuel and provisions that arrived precisely on schedule. And every time I heard that methodical, clean, unbroken enemy traffic, I felt how fragile our defense was. Order received from division, I said, looking up from the log. They asked for a morale report. Emphasized that spirits are high, but losses require rotation. Muller let out a short, hysterical laugh. And what happens if we report that we are running out of clean drinking water and the infantry needs more anti-tank weapons? I stared at him. Then they won't send anti-tank weapons. They'll send a morale officer. Write the report, Muller. Spirits are high. Everyone believes in the Führer. Write it. It is necessary. This was our contrast. Reality smelled of powder and blood. Propaganda smelled of printing ink. And my job was to be the bridge between them, a bridge held together by wishful thinking and a few old vacuum tubes. Through the hum of the static, I suddenly caught something new. A high, steady sound, unlike any I knew. A German pilot would call it the sound of death. It was the American spotter planes. If they were flying, they were searching. And if they found something, the enemy artillery worked according to a system called unlimited supply. Prepare yourselves, men, I said. Changing frequency. Something extraordinary is about to happen. Wagner, Make sure you haven't left our receiver tuned to 4130. Wagner nodded, his face like stone. We waited. The sky was covered in a heavy, damp haze. We waited until the tension became physical. The silence before a battle, as I learned in the East, doesn't exist. There is always sound, the buzzing of flies, a bird's cry, a distant shot. But this silence was heavy. It pressed on the ears, making the eardrums vibrate with anticipation. I caught myself counting my own heartbeats. The professional instinct of a signalman: maintain rhythm. Rhythm is the key to Morse. Rhythm is order. Half an hour, exactly, Muller whispered, looking at the wristwatch, a gift from his mother. I shook my head. No, this is not artillery preparation. Artillery always starts with reconnaissance. This sounds like they are waiting for the sun to hide behind the clouds, or waiting for the wind to change direction. I was right, but in the worst possible way. The first sign was not auditory, but vibrational. The earth began to tremble, not from explosions, but from thrust. A low, muffled roar that grew from beyond the horizon. It sounded as if hundreds of trains were moving at immense speed on parallel tracks, heading directly for us. What is it, Carl? Wagner asked, exhibiting his first sign of emotion in hours, a slight confusion. I knew what it was. I had seen reports from Italy. The Americans called it carpet. At that moment, precisely 9:30 a.m. on July 25th, the sky ripped open. I cannot call it a sound. It was the complete annihilation of sound. It was physical violence. Thousands of bombs, dropped from 5 kilometers, arrived not as separate explosions, but as a continuous, unified impact. The pressure waves slammed into the barn. We were thrown onto the dirt floor. The glass tubes of the radio sets burst. The generator choked and died. I felt my teeth grate from the vibration. It felt as if a colossal, invisible fist was pounding the earth with rhythmic, industrial savagery. The ground beneath us ceased to be solid. It became loose, quicksand. We were at the epicenter of an artificial earthquake, created with precision and methodology. Dust, mixed with splinters of straw, wood shavings, and the smell of hot sulfur, filled the barn. I couldn't see anything. I only heard Muller screaming. But I didn't actually hear screams. I only heard that incessant, crushing roar. I remembered that I needed to breathe. I crawled under our main table, which offered some meager protection from the falling debris, and tried to clamp my hands over my ears. Useless. The sound penetrated through bone. It was inside my brain. It seemed to last an eternity. But in reality, according to the chronometer glued to the shattered transceiver, it lasted only 45 minutes. 45 minutes to destroy an entire front line. When the roar began to subside, it was almost worse than the roar itself. A deafening, ringing silence. And then, the falling debris, the sizzling of burning straw. Status. I yelled, feeling like my vocal cords were torn. Alive, Wagner replied. His voice was dry, like sand. Muller was weeping, clutching his head. Not from pain. From shock. I stood up. The barn was reduced to a half-collapsed pit. Wooden beams lay crosswise. But our table, under which the batteries and the main transmitter stood, had held. A miracle of engineering, or just sheer luck? I rushed to the apparatus. The wiring was severed, but the main body of the FUG-10 was intact. The generator was buried under debris. Wagner, I need power. Right now, I commanded. Wagner was already clearing the rubble. His hands moved with mechanical precision. We were signalmen. Our world was collapsing, but our machine had to work. 15 minutes later, to the accompaniment of secondary explosions, we managed to start the torn. Fu. B1. Our reserve, low-power field radio, running on a hand-crank generator. The airwaves were pure chaos. And a ghostly silence. The main command post, which should have been 2 kilometers away, was silent. The 10th Company, which held the key intersection, was silent. The entire central part of our regimental sector had simply vanished. Not retreated. Not been beaten. It was annihilated. I frantically spun the tuning knob, trying to find a single familiar call sign. Only static, permeated by anxious American traffic. And then I caught it. Faint, but absolutely clear, a German voice. The channel of the 901st Panzergrenadier Regiment, which held the position closest to the maximum bombing zone. Hear us? We are under fire. We are being hit by our own. I repeat, our own. The voice was on the verge of breaking, drowned out by the rising noise. Muller clenched his jaw. He recognized the voice. They were hit. Our own artillery hit them, Carl. Muller screamed, trying to overcome the ringing in his ears. I knew it was possible. In the rush, in the chaos, due to an incorrectly marked zone or an error in wind calculation. But this was not an error. I intercepted a message from the same source, but this time from an officer. Where's the support? Air cover. We are being destroyed by fire. 300 meters too. And then the connection was cut. Permanently. I recorded the time and frequency in the log. This was not just a military tragedy. It was the beginning of the end. When your own internal chaos starts working against you with the same force as the enemy's industrial hammer, you cease to exist as a fighting unit. I tried to contact division headquarters. Finally, I broke through the hum to the duty radio operator, old, gravel-voiced Feldwebel Schmidt, whom I had known since the Eastern Front. Schmidt, this is 22nd Regiment. Report, Central Sector is dark. Coordinates zeroed out. What was that? A pause. Schmidt couldn't afford panic. He was too old for that. Operation Cobra has been initiated, Carl. Massive breakthrough. We were told our bombers hit the Americans. They must have missed. Missed? They covered our front line for 2 kilometers deep. That's not a miss. That's grinding the earth. Does our command know there is no one left there? Carl, stop panicking. You must immediately move east. The breakthrough is imminent. You must maintain communication for the retreating units. Forget the darkness. Proceed to point 430 gamma. I disconnected the radio. Wagner waited silently. Muller looked at me, and in his eyes, the question lingered. Are we alive? Or are we just shadows who must retreat because the place where we stood no longer exists? We pack up, I said, gesturing towards the ruined barn. We take only the essentials. 2 torn. Fu. B1S, batteries, coaxial cable, pistols, and the logs. We need to move. This entire area is now a no man's land that the American tanks will fill in an hour. I felt something break inside me. For 5 weeks, we had been the nervous center. Now we were merely refugees, lugging the tools of our former authority. We moved on foot. Having lost our truck, we became beasts of burden. 2 radio sets, 2 battery packs, antennae, hand-crank generators, tens of kilograms of dead, but essential, steel. The bocage, which yesterday was our protection, today became our tormentor. We had to struggle through thick, tangled hedgerows that tore our uniforms and scratched our skin. The air was heavy and damp, and the ground underfoot was slick with mud and a strange, oily residue left by the explosives. An acrid, suffocating smell hung in the air, not just gunpowder, but burnt fuel, and the stench of internal organs baked in the sun, which pierced the nostrils and clung to the throat. We walked through what had been the position of the 12th Company an hour ago. There were no bodies. There were no trenches. There was only a deep, black furrow, filled with viscous mud, in which scraps of equipment floated. The bombs had mixed men, earth, and wood into a single, lifeless pulp. This was not a battle. It was an erasure. Our orders were withdraw and regroup to the southeast. An order that sounded elegant on paper, but in practice meant, run until you run into the Americans. We encountered a group of grenadiers. 4 of them. They were dragging a machine gun and were so shell-shocked they could barely speak. Radio man, do you know where to go? Their NCO asked, his eyes white with dust. Point 430 gamma. Regrouping. I replied, trying to sound confident. The Americans are already there, Feldwebel. Their tanks broke through an hour ago. They are moving without stopping. There are hundreds of them. I knew he was exaggerating. Not hundreds, perhaps 20. But for 4 exhausted soldiers, 20 tanks might as well be hundreds. Muller started shaking. He stumbled and dropped a coil of wire. I picked it up. Keep your head up, Muller. Panic is static. We don't need static. I wasn't talking about the radio. I was talking about his mind. We moved on, using our skills as signalmen to navigate, not by maps, but by sound. The sound of heavy tracks and the distant rumble of engines, which moved slowly but inexorably eastward. American armor. We set up the radio again in a makeshift hide under a massive oak. There was no time to deploy a proper antenna. We just threw the wire onto the ground, hoping for a miracle. I started listening. This time, American traffic. At this moment, I reached the climax of my professional realization. It was not a scream of panic or despair. It was the cold, calculated statistics that I heard in a foreign, calm language. The Americans were not rushing. They methodically requested corrections for coordinates, reported distance covered, and requested fuel. I heard the commander of a tank battalion, call sign Cadillac, 6, reporting. Proceeded 12 kilometers. Resistance, scattered infantry groups. Awaiting refueling. Where is our air cover? And the reply, Cadillac, 6, air cover is directly overhead. You just can't see them. P-47s on standby, ready on request. Fuel in 1 hour. Proceed on schedule. I compared this to our reality. Our regiment had covered 1.5 kilometers in 6 hours, lugging radios. Our tank crews were promised fuel tomorrow, possibly. Our aircraft? Non-existent. If a German pilot appeared, he instantly became a target for 10 P-47s that seemed to patrol the sky 24 hours a day. I did the math in my head. My fingers, trained on the Morse key, counted not dots and dashes, but tonnage. 50,000 tons of bombs, I whispered to Wagner. That's what they dropped this morning alone. That's more than our entire annual shell supply in the West. Wagner nodded, his gaze fixed on the generator. Carl, their traffic is uninterrupted, Muller said, his voice strained. They are talking about 300 trucks moving on one road. 300. We waited for 12 for the entire division last week. This was the moment of revelation that I could never explain to the staff in Berlin. The war was not lost due to a lack of courage. We were courageous. We were professional. We clung to every hedgerow as if it were our last chance. The war was lost in industrial statistics. While we sat in this damp cellar, conserving every drop of fuel for the generator, the Americans, according to their own reports, were calmly delivering thousands of gallons of gasoline, fresh ammunition, and even, judging by scraps of coded messages, ice cream and cigarettes. They weren't fighting us. They were erasing us from the map through superior logistics. Their war was a clean, mechanical, merciless machine. Ours was a desperate, heroic, but hopeless struggle against an endless conveyor belt. I felt a glacial calm settle over me. If you know the math, you know the result. And the result was clear. We managed to contact the remnants of regimental staff again. The colonel was dead. Command was assumed by Major von Eschenbach, a young, fanatic man who, apparently, had never seen real combat, only propaganda films. He was furious. He demanded a counterattack report. Feldwebel Hellman, why have you not reported the commencement of the counterattack according to Plan 7A? I hesitated. Plan 7A was a joke. It called for an attack by 3 tank companies, of which only 3 actual tanks remained at this point. Major, at this moment, our positions are under direct enemy fire. We are attempting to regroup the remaining grenadiers. What counterattack? Silence, he hissed. We are being monitored. Division staff requires a report that will convince them we are not running. You must transmit. Reserves deployed, flanking counterattack commencing at 1800 hours. Breakthrough contained. Awaiting air support for decisive strike. I felt sickened. Major, if I transmit this lie, and division believes it, they may send the remaining weakened units to these coordinates. It will be mass murder. Do you dare to question an order? His voice, turned to steel, transmitted through the radio. Your job is communications, not strategy. Transmit the report immediately, Hellman. Otherwise, I will authorize your execution for sabotage. I looked at Muller. His face was pale. He was waiting. I could not disobey. Discipline was the last thing preventing us from turning into a band of looters. But I could execute the order professionally. Give me a few seconds for encryption, Major, I said. I took the microphone, pressed the Morse key. I transmitted the required lie, using our standard Army code. But I did it with one crucial deviation. Instead of the standard closing code, I used an old, almost forgotten, personal communication code that Schmidt and I had developed in 1941 when we needed to bypass censorship to report shortages of winter clothing. It was just one extra dot and dash at the end. The message meant, counterattack, 0. If Schmidt heard it, he would understand. It meant, report transmitted under duress. Information is false. Use it to cover a retreat, but not for an attack. I released the key. My heart was pounding. I had just become an accomplice to a great, fatal lie. But I maintained my rank. I maintained my rhythm. The sky began to darken. We had been moving for nearly a day, running on no sleep and fueled only by dry rations and adrenaline. We reached a small village where we thought some of our forces might still remain. The silence was deceptive. We sensed the Americans were near, but we couldn't see them. I switched on the torn. Foo. B1 again. I wanted to know if the lie had reached its destination and how Schmidt had responded. Instead, I heard a strong, pulsating signal that drowned out our frequency. It was a powerful transmitter, very close. Muller, jamming. They are close. Too close. At that very moment, a deafening roar erupted. It wasn't artillery fire. It was the sound of diesel engines and the clanking of tracks on asphalt. They had arrived. We were on a narrow country road. Around a bend, hidden by a thick hedgerow, a silhouette appeared. Tall, angular, an American tank. An M4A3E2 Sherman Jumbo. I knew our anti-tank artillery had been almost completely destroyed. We only carried one Panzerfaust as a reserve. The tank stopped right in front of us. An American commander, helmeted, with binoculars, peered out of the hatch, seemingly unaware of us. He was speaking on the radio, confidently, quickly. I heard him call out our coordinates. We are at Bison Charlie position. Village sweep completed. Awaiting infantry. Confirm we are the spearhead in this sector. I looked at Wagner. He stared back. We hadn't been discovered by direction finding. We had simply been in the path of their advance guard. Quickly, destroy the equipment. My command was quiet, but sharp. My hand reached for the transmitter. I started ripping out wires, smashing the vacuum tubes. It was an act of vandalism for me. My instrument, my life, my connection to the world, was being turned into junk. Wagner smashed the indicator panel with a hammer and flooded the batteries with water from his canteen. Muller, who had been weeping earlier, now acted with focused fury, breaking the casing of the spare transceiver. A minute later, we were unarmed, in terms of communications. We had been reduced to ordinary, dirty infantrymen. The tank slowly drove past us, narrowly missing our ruined position. The commander didn't even turn his head. We were too insignificant. We hid in the ruins of the nearest house. Our regiment was broken. Our connection to command had vanished. Our professional function had been nullified. We crawled into the basement of a ruined stone farmhouse, smelling of damp, decay, and something sweet, jam, perhaps, spilled during the shelling. There were 3 of us. Muller, Wagner, and I. We were silent. Wagner reached inside his tunic. I saw it. The torn. Foo. B1. An old, low-power field radio that Wagner had saved by wrapping it in his wet greatcoat. Weak signal. Short range only, Carl. And not for long, Wagner whispered, his voice barely audible. We were signalmen. We couldn't just sit and wait. I began to analyze. Our only hope was in the chaos we could create in their rear. I tuned to the American frequency using that tiny, miraculously surviving apparatus. I listened to snippets. Confident, yet slightly strained voices. They had broken through, but their logistics were stretched. I heard a key term. They were talking about Assembly Point C and special cargo. They gave coordinates. I quickly scribbled them on a dirty scrap of newspaper. Southwest, in a small grove. Fuel, I told Wagner. A whole tanker, and possibly a command vehicle. If our last few artillery batteries hit that target, it could delay the American breakthrough by half a day. Half a day? That was all we could dream of. Time for a few thousand men to escape the encirclement. The problem was that the transmission would take 90 seconds. With a transmitter as powerful as the Torn. Foo. B1. In an open field, they would pinpoint us. 100% certainty. We cannot use encryption, I said. It will take too long. We must transmit the clear coordinates. A death sentence, Wagner stated flatly. Yes, but it is our job, Wagner. Our final duty to the regiment. If I transmit, and you disconnect in 90 seconds, we might succeed. But they will come for us. I looked at Muller. He sat with his knees pulled up. I will transmit, Carl, he said, his voice surprisingly firm. Is your Morse clean? I asked. Perfectly. Cleaner than yours, old goat. You tapped too fast. He smiled for the first time in the last 24 hours. The smile was bitter. I handed him the sheet with the coordinates. You transmit 3 times. Reconnaissance data, coordinates, confirmation. I will time it. Wagner, be ready to yank the wires. Wagner nodded. It was strange. No heroism. Just professional calculation. The price of salvation was our death, and we were willing to pay it because it was the only function left to us. Mueller put on the headphones. I felt a current run through my body as I connected the hand cranked to the battery. "Ready?" I said. Mueller nodded, his eyes closed. He took a deep breath, and his fingers settled onto the key. The silence of the cellar was shattered by a high-pitched, piercing whistle. Dit-da-dit, da-da-da, dit-da-dit. The coordinates. They were transmitted with such clarity, with such perfect rhythm, that even through the chaos of interference, any radio operator on the other side of the front would understand them. This was a message not from a frightened soldier, but from a cold, professional observer. I watched the clock. The seconds crawled by. 15, 30. Somewhere above us, I knew, American direction-finding teams were scrambling. They had trucks full of equipment that could pinpoint our source within a few meters. Mueller was transmitting the second part of the message, assessment of enemy forces, fuel presence. 60 seconds. I felt a shiver run down my spine. We were arrogant. We were defiant. We were slapping them in the face in a way they couldn't ignore. Dit-dit-dit, da-da. 75 seconds. Mueller was finishing. Target confirmation. 85 seconds. I gave the signal. Wagner ripped the wire. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. We waited. There was no explosion, no cry. Only our heavy, interrupted breaths. I switched the torn. Foo. B1 back to receiver mode. The airwaves were exploding with American traffic. They were panicking. Source. Find a source. They got the coordinates. They had located us. 3 minutes later, it started. First, a distant, powerful thud that made the basement walls tremble. Hit, Wagner whispered, a faint, barely perceptible smile on his face. Yes, I replied. We bought them time. But almost immediately after the first salvo, which clearly went to the American fuel depot, another, closer sound started. Not artillery. Tracks. And voices. American patrols heading directly for the farmhouse. They had pinpointed us with incredible speed. We were cornered. We hid behind stacked sacks of potatoes. The patrol came down into the cellar. Flashlights. Bright light that blinded us after the long darkness. They saw us. Exhausted, covered in mud and dust. But not afraid. They saw the broken radio. A young American soldier, almost a child, pointed his submachine gun at us. His commander, an officer in a clean uniform, spoke in English. The radio. You are the radio operators. I nodded. I wasn't going to lie. The moment of truth was not about fighting. It was about accepting the ending. I stood still, allowing them to search me. They found my signals log, but they understood neither the encryption nor the numbers. To them, it was just useless rubbish. I looked at the American officer. He was clean, shaven, confident. He did not look like a man fighting on the brink of exhaustion. He looked like a man executing his work on schedule. My mind finally stopped operating in emergency communication mode. The silence I had craved for so long settled in. And in that silence, I heard the truth resonate. We didn't lose because we lacked courage. We lost because we were part of an old, feudal system that tried to counter industrial might. I remembered the calm voice of Cadillac 6, requesting fuel and air cover. They had everything. They had endless production. They had logistics that worked like clockwork, regardless of what we did. My profession, communications, gave me a unique, deadly overview. I was the nervous center that heard the heart of a nation stop beating. On that day, when thousands of tons of American steel crashed down on us, when I realized our own headquarters ordered me to lie to save face, and when I saw how easily an American tank drove through our impassable front, I understood. The war wasn't lost here, in the muddy bocage. It was lost when we failed to build as many factories as Detroit. It was lost in the supply accounting tables, in the columns for fuel and ammunition. I felt an incredible weight lift from my shoulders. The weight of the nervous center's responsibility. I no longer had to listen. I no longer had to transmit lies. I was a prisoner, but I was free from the mathematics of defeat. I simply waited to be let out into the light and taken to the people who operated this limitless, relentless machine. It was not defeat. It was completion. And in that completion, I found a bitter peace.